We'll start on chapter 14, and this chapter covers the brain and the cranial nerve specifically. So the first part of the chapter focuses mainly on the anatomy of the brain, the parts of the brain, the size, different characteristics of the brain. But later on, what you all will learn about are the functional areas of the brain. In other words, what does the precentral gyrus control? Okay, so you'll have an idea of what parts of the brain provide what mechanisms of control of the body. Some characteristics of the brain, again, are that it equals 97% of the body's neural tissue in adults. The typical brain weighs about 3 pounds, and the size varies among individuals. Males have a slightly larger brain than females, but there's no correlation between brain size and intelligence. And the cerebrum, which is what most people call the brain, is the largest part of the brain. So now you know that's just called the cerebrum. Everybody say cerebrum. Cerebrum. That's the cerebrum. So the main large part of the brain is called the cerebrum. So anytime you see this word, cerebral, any idea what that means? Medical terminology, students? Right. So if you drop the ending on cerebrum and add AL, AL means what? Pertaining to. So cerebral is pertaining to the cerebrum. So now anytime you see that word cerebral, you know it's referring or pertaining to the cerebrum. Okay, so the cerebrum has an outer surface called the cortex, the cerebral cortex. And you all may have heard of gray matter and white matter. You need to know where those are distributed in the brain. We talked about in the spinal cord that gray matter was where? On the inside, and white matter surrounded the gray matter. Well, on the cerebrum, it's the opposite. So on the brain, the gray matter is on the outer surface, and the white matter is deep to the gray matter. And some of the external features, the surface features of the brain, notice that there are grooves, and there are what I call ridges or chunks of tissue. So the creases between those chunks are called sulci, and that's plural. The singular form of sulci is what? Sulcus. So the sulc, if I ask you about a particular sulcus, you know I'm talking about a crease. And you will have to know some of the names for the test on Friday, some of the sulci. And then gyri are the ridges of tissue. And fissures are just like sulci, but they're much deeper. Okay, so you should be familiar with some of the landmarks here. So you have the cerebrum. There are other parts of the brain. So the cerebrum, as I said, is just the main large part of the brain. But there's also an area of the brain called the dencephalon, which includes the thalamus and hypothalamus, also the epithalamus. You also have the brainstem, which we'll talk a little bit about. And my favorite part is the medulla oblongata. We'll talk about some of the functions there. And then the cerebellum. So the cerebrum, thalamus, hypothalamus, the brainstem, which includes the midbrain, pons, and medulla. And then you have the cerebellum. Everybody say cerebellum. Cerebellum. So you have the cerebrum, and the cerebellum. All of this is brainstem, the midbrain, the pons, and medulla. All right, so this picture should be familiar to you all, right? And there's also, anybody know what this is? Good, the corpus callosum. And notice the color difference. It's white. So what you have there are tracts, fiber tracts. Remember what tracts are? Right, so nerve fibers in the brain, and the tracts in the corpus callosum are called commissural because they cross over from one side to the other. So there you'll find neurons that are sending a signal from the left hemisphere to the right and vice versa, allowing the two hemispheres to communicate with one another. So that's a nice little piece of information there. And then how do you remember which is thalamus and which is hypothalamus? Hypo means below. You'd be surprised how many people flip it. Hypothalamus and thalamus. You just use that. Hypo means what? Below. So anytime there's a word with hypo on the beginning, you know it's below whatever that is. The hypothalamus is below the thalamus. And again, you have the midbrain pons and medulla oblongata. And I like this picture because really if you look at the previous picture, you can't really tell that there's space there. Not really. But on this one, you can see that there's space. Okay, so there's a cavity, and that's actually one of the ventricles that we'll talk about. So the ventricles contain CSF that circulates on the inside, and also it bathes the outside of the brain and spinal cord. Okay, so the lobes. So the cerebrum has 5 lobes. Remember the skull? How many cranial bones? And they are? So you have the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. So you have those same regions or lobes of the cerebrum, but there's an additional lobe called the insula, and you can't see it from the outer surface. You have to pull away the temporal lobe to actually see it. So you can see the insula here. And then you have to pull the temporal lobe in order to see that part of the cerebrum. All right, so this should be pretty familiar to you all. One of the things I want you all to take notice of here, though, while we're here, are some landmarks that we'll talk about throughout this chapter. One being the central sulcus, and the central sulcus is an important landmark because it what? Divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Everybody see that? So you have the central sulcus, and it is the dividing point between the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. It also divides 2 gyri, and these are probably the only gyri that you'll need to know by name and function. You have the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. Where do those names come from? Precentral, postcentral. So it's called the precentral gyrus because it's what? Before what? Before the central sulcus, right? And the postcentral gyrus is called the postcentral gyrus because it's after the central sulcus. So those 3 areas you should be familiar with. And on the theory exam next week, you may have questions like that. The true or false, the central sulcus divides the frontal lobe from parietal, things like that, the precentral gyrus from postcentral gyrus. And then you also have the lateral sulcus, and you need to have an idea where that is. I like to say that the lateral sulcus divides the frontal lobe from the frontal and part of the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. Okay. So divides the temporal lobe from the frontal and from the parietal lobe. So be familiar with these, and again, you may get a question in true false format or something like that. So again, know where the postcentral and precentral gyri are. The transverse cerebral fissure, I didn't point out, but it separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. Let's go back to the picture. So that will be here. Transverse cerebral fissure. And then the lateral sulcus we just mentioned, and the longitudinal fissure we did not mention, but it separates the two what? The two cerebral hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere. And you can see that in this picture. So this is the longitudinal fissure dividing the left hemisphere from the right. And this picture also shows you the difference between a sulcus and a fissure. So you see the fissure is deeper than the sulcus. Any questions? Oh, one other thing to point out there. What do we say about the distribution of gray versus white matter? So gray matter is on the outside, and that part of the cerebrum is referred to as the cerebral what? Cortex. So you can see the cerebral cortex is gray. Okay? So what do we mostly find in gray matter? Neuron cell bodies, right. So remember, the cell bodies are primarily what makes up gray matter, whereas white matter is made up of myelinated axons. Good. Don't forget those points that we mentioned before. Okay, so this is just an overview of some of the functional areas. We'll go a little bit deeper later. So just in general, you should have an idea of what the different parts of the cerebrum actually control. What do they do? The frontal lobe contains what's called the primary motor cortex, and I would like for you all to know what that means. So for each of these, you'll see there's a primary cortex and association cortex. Primary, association. So have an idea what we mean when we say a primary cortex and an association cortex. Okay, so again, the frontal lobe contains the primary motor cortex, and its specific location is the precentral gyrus. So remember that the precentral gyrus was part of what lobe? The frontal lobe. So that's what we're talking about. So the precentral gyrus has an important function of transmitting motor signals to our effectors. So we talked before about the two divisions, sensory versus motor. Tell me about the motor division. So the motor division, where does the signal start? In the CNS and goes to an effector, muscles and glands, right? So what specific part of the CNS do motor signals start? The precentral gyrus. Okay, so when you all, as you all write, just keep in mind before your hand starts to move, that part of your brain, the precentral gyrus, is active in sending signals out to your the muscles that you want to move. So that's the area that controls voluntary movement. Also, the frontal lobe contains speech centers, which we'll get into a little later. And the parietal lobe contains the primary sensory cortex. Really, it's called the primary somatic sensory cortex because there are a lot of other sensory areas. But the primary somatic sensory means sense of touch, pain, all of those sensations, not vision and hearing, which are also sensory. So the primary sensory cortex controls our ability to recognize sensation. So if we're being touched, tickled, if there's any pain, then the signals, those types of signals start where? For pain, touch, they start Right, so they start at receptors. So if someone touches me there, that activates receptors, which send signals to the CNS. What part of the CNS? The post. So when I'm touched here, that activates receptors that send signals to my spinal cord up to my CNS. What part? Post central gyrus, right. So connect the dots. All right. And then there's something called a sensory association area. Okay, so what's the difference? So the difference between a primary area and an association area is the primary area is responsible for the actual the signal either occurring at all. So, for example, if one way to look at it is if one or the other is damaged. So if my primary sensory cortex is damaged, let's say I have a stroke that cuts off blood flow to my post-central gyrus, those cells in my post-central gyrus die. So now what would be the effect of that? Right, so since the post-central gyrus is responsible for receiving sensory signals from the body, then you would not be able to feel. You'd have numbness on some part of your body. Okay? Whereas if my post-central gyrus was damaged by the stroke, what would be the effect? Then I wouldn't be able to move some part of my body. Okay? And it depends on what part. So the gyrus extends from the top all the way around. So there could be a stroke that just affects this part or just this part. And each part controls some part of the body. And you may have a picture called a homunculus in your book. I'm not sure. It used to be in the old book, but it tells you exactly what parts control sensation or movement of what part of the body. Okay? So on the test, what I might say, what would be the result of a lesion to the post-central gyrus? And loss of sensation. What would be the effect of a lesion to the precentral gyrus? Paralysis, loss of movement. Right. Okay, so what about the sensory association area, which is a broader, larger area, and what that part of the brain is responsible for is interpreting the signal that comes in. So you have the primary sensory cortex that detects some stimulus. So you know, okay, something just happened. But if you have a stroke that affects just your sensory association cortex and doesn't affect your primary sensory cortex, then you will still feel things. You just would not be able to interpret what you're feeling. Okay? For example, you could stick your hand in a bag that has a bunch of objects, rocks, paper, scissors, a penny, piece of cotton. You may pick up the cotton and think it's a rock. Okay? So that's what the association area does. It receives the information and interprets what type of stimulus actually came in and the location. So you may stub your toe and you may grab your elbow. You may feel like, okay, it's my elbow hurting, not my toes. So the sensory association area is responsible then for interpretation of the signal coming in. And that's going to be the same with the occipital. So the occipital lobe has the primary visual and the visual association cortex. So the primary visual cortex then is responsible for receiving signals from the eye, right? The eye, the retina, sends the signal on back to the occipital lobe. And if the signal does not make it to the occipital lobe, what's the effect? Blindness. We don't see. Okay? So again, any type of sensory information has to make it to its destination on the brain. So if it doesn't make it there, then we don't recognize that signal. The visual association area, on the other hand, so let's play that same thing again. So if there's a lesion on the primary visual cortex, that will result in blindness. Whereas if the primary visual is still intact, but there's damage to the visual association cortex, the result would be you can see, you just won't recognize what you're seeing. Okay? You may look at me and think I'm a Jeep Cherokee or something. Okay? So it's just not going to make any sense. And I remember reading about that when I was in college. A man had an issue. I guess he had a stroke or something was wrong with his visual association area. And he would come in and think his wife was a hat, you know. He would try to pick her up and put her on his head and wonder why she couldn't get up there. So, yeah.
How would like doctors diagnose that as being damage to that rather than some kind of memory loss, like an Alzheimer's patient thinking that a person is something else? How would they distinguish between those two?
Well, basically what they'll do is do a CAT scan and see what part of the brain is messed up. But as soon as they go in, for example, if a person comes in and they can't move one side, they have an idea what the problem is, and they know what part of the brain is affected. I told my other classes about Congresswoman Giffords, I think her name was. I remember they did a report on her, I think the day after she was shot, and Sanjay Gupta was talking about how he was there, and the doctors said they tried to shake her left hand and then tried to shake her right hand, and she could shake with, I can't remember which one, the left but not the right. So they knew right away that that part of her precentral gyrus was damaged, and they knew which side. It's the opposite side of the limb that is not functioning. And they also said that she was alert, she was awake, but she could not speak. So they knew that must have been one of the speech areas. So they also saw the bullet hole, so they knew what side it was on. But even if there was no bullet hole, the doctors have an idea based on what you can and cannot do, what areas of your brain may be affected. Okay, so these are just giving you an idea of those areas we just spoke of. So the motor cortex, so you should think of the frontal lobe as carrying out most of the motor function. And also emotion. Emotion has a large part in the control by the frontal lobe. And then the parietal lobe is, for the most part, going to have sensory function. So you have the sensory, primary sensory, and then the somatic sensory association. And then what do we say about the occipital lobe? That's the visual area. So if it's damaged, you can expect blindness to occur or loss in ability to interpret what you're seeing, visual stimuli. And then the primary auditory and auditory association areas are there part of the temporal lobe. Okay. And the motor association. So again, here's another association area that's responsible for coordination of learned movements. Motor memory, which we'll get into later. Okay. And taste and smell functions, so gustatory. Gustation means gustation, taste. So gustation means taste. So the primary taste area of the brain is the insula. So again, to get to the insula, you have to pull away the temporal lobe. And then the primary olfactory meaning what? Smell, sense of smell. is located there as well. What's that C area?
Like when you smell something, not know what you smell. Or
The olfactory area?
you know the same way you can see it, not know what you see.
Association areas, yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Right, so if that part of the brain is damaged, I'm not sure how often that happens, though.
So would it be like something that is actually not that pleasant? Would it be pleasant to you, or?
Probably, or you just have no idea.
It's just no sensations, correct?
Well, that's the primary, the primary, but the primary olfactory cortex. But they were asking about the association. What would be the effects of damage there? You just wouldn't be able to interpret what it is you're smelling. But most problems having to do with smell are more locally, not in the brain. And we'll get to that in the next chapter. Okay, but what I do want you all to kind of put together, I know it's a lot to remember, but just keep in mind any sensation, whether it's vision, smell, hearing, touch, all sensations, the signals start where? At a receptor. Okay, so for your vision, those receptors are where? In your eye. For smell, the receptors are in your nose. But the signal starts there but ends up on some part of the brain. And that's what we're talking about here. What part of the brain does the signals end up? Okay, let's go over language. Language and speech functional areas. So this speaks of the parts of the brain that provide us our ability to speak. Language includes several abilities, including reading, writing, speaking, and understanding words assigned to different regions of the cerebral cortex. So there are two main language areas that you should be familiar with. They are called the Wernicke's area and the Broca's area. And you can see those here. You have the Broca's area here and the Wernicke's area there. And they're usually on one hemisphere, left or right. More than likely they're going to be on the left hemisphere. So that is one important piece of information there about those speech areas. So remember the names, Broca's and Wernicke's. And also you should have an idea of how they're different. They both involve speech, but Wernicke's is more involved in speech comprehension, and Broca's area is more motor. And you can remember that because of the location. Look where the Broca's area is. It's very close to the what? The primary motor and motor association areas right there in the center. You have motor association and the Broca's area right there. So the Broca's area is the motor speech area. What does that mean? So if you think about it, so anytime you get ready to speak, before any words start to come out, the part of your brain that is highly active is the Wernicke's area. So the Wernicke's area transmits a plan of speech. So before you even speak, this is the part of the brain that is generating the plan and sending it on to the Broca's area. Okay, so the Broca's area, what does it do? It receives the information from the Wernicke's area and actually generates a motor program for the muscles of the larynx, tongue, cheeks, and lips. So the Broca's area is responsible for telling the correct muscles to contract so that you speak the right words. Okay? So it transmits a program to the primary motor cortex or commands to the lower motor neurons that supply those muscles. So you have those, you have the Wernicke's area sending a signal to the Broca's area, which sends a signal to the primary motor cortex, and then on out to those muscles. It's amazing, isn't it? Mm-hmm.
I'd be tired if I had to do all that by myself every day.
Exactly. So this, so if there's something that goes wrong, so again, a stroke can affect any part of the brain. So what if there's a stroke that affects the Broca's area? That would be called Broca's aphasia, also referred to as non-fluent aphasia. So going back, what do we say the Broca's area is responsible for? The actual muscle contraction involved in speech. So those who have a lesion to their Broca's area, this is fairly common with some people who have strokes. Slow speech, difficulty in choosing words, using words that only approximate the correct word. And they can only say a few words, so the actual number of words spoken is reduced. Whereas if it's the Wernicke's area affected, the lesion to Wernicke's area will allow the speech to be normal but excessive. So instead of saying sentences that make sense, it's just a bunch of words flying out rapidly. So the muscles are getting signals, but they're not the right signals, in other words. Okay? So they have a difficult time speaking correctly and choosing the correct words. And then there's something called anomic aphasia, which the individual can speak normally and understand speech, but cannot identify written words or pictures. Okay, and then the functional brain systems, don't get too bogged down on these. These brain systems are just a network of different areas of the brain. You'll see that the limbic system is referred to as the emotional brain. And it includes the amygdala, the cingulate gyrus, and hippocampus, which we'll mention in a moment, whereas the reticular formation extends through the entire brainstem and also extends up to parts of the cortex. So let's look at a few specifics here. So the limbic system, so it's showing you all the parts associated. So here is one of my favorite parts of the brain, the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the main area of the brain that controls memory. So the hippocampus, you should link that with memory, hippocampus memory. Okay? And so you can see here it's a loop. The limbic system is referred to as a loop of cortical structures, interconnected. And what they provide is both gratification and aversion. And gratification, of course, is sensation of pleasure or reward. You all have you all had Psychology 200? So you've probably heard about this stuff before. And aversion, sensation of fear or sorrow. The limbic system includes the nuclei and tracks along the border of the cerebrum and dencephalon. But again, the main thing that you should think about when you hear limbic system is emotion, emotional memory, emotional areas for rage, fear, pain, sexual arousal, and pleasure.
Does it go back in the cortex with the sympathetic and parasympathetic?
Not really. So areas that produce heightened alertness, generalized excitement, generalized lethargy. So just those areas of emotion, also called the affective brain. And the main part I'll ask you about is the hippocampus. Plays a significant role in learning and memory formation. Okay, so limbic system, emotional part of the brain. And one example is, it says ex-boyfriend's cologne. So if you remember back 10 years ago, when you all are kind of young, maybe 5 years ago, and you may have had a boyfriend or girlfriend who wore a certain cologne. And now you smell that cologne and you think back to that time. And you may get angry, you may get happy, you may start to smile. That's your limbic system at work. Trouble?
Something when people say they associate certain food smells from their childhood.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Grandma's biscuits cooking. That
Oh,
kind of
yeah, exactly. That's a good idea, too. A good way to think about it. So any of those songs, you hear songs that may make you think back to another time. Okay, the reticular formation. The main thing about this one is that it plays a central role in our state of consciousness, such as alertness and sleep. Consciousness is a state of wakefulness, and this part of the brain is very sensitive to the effects of certain drugs and alcohol. So some drugs you don't want to mix with alcohol because they can be fatal very quickly, and some can cause you to go into a coma and never come out, so a permanent state of unconsciousness. And the reticular formation, again, is going to include the parts of the brainstem that actually communicate with the cerebral cortex. Something else that's interesting here. So consciousness, awareness, alertness. So you have this part of the brain, these network areas of the brain sending impulses to the cerebral cortex to keep it conscious and alert. But it's able to what? Filter out repetitive and weak stimuli. Severe injury results in permanent unconsciousness. So you'll hear about people who are on certain drugs and they start feeling like things are crawling on them. Whereas right now, you can feel your clothes on your body, right? But you're not focused in on that. And that's because our normal nervous system will filter out those signals that we don't need to focus in on. But again, being on drugs, that affects this part, so you pay attention to every little feeling that you have, anything on your body, and you feel like things are crawling on you or coming at you. Heightened sensitivity. Okay, learning and memory. Let's take a break.